All right. I think it's time for us to get started. All right. I'm going to go a little old school this morning. I left all my phones at home this morning. So, book. All right. You guys were the brave souls that came back for class number 2. So, as we start our class number 2, last week we started a new quarter. We started a new thing with 3 items that I coined kind of resolutions to live by. And we started kind of getting ready to touch on the patience of Job. So before I get started, anyone remember the last class? Anything we talked about? Okay, that's the second one. That's the second point we're going to talk about in probably the middle section of the quarter. So that's what we're going to start talking about today and go for the next couple of weeks, okay?
And a heart like God looking at David.
Okay, and that's the third thing, right? You know, a heart like God and looking at David's life, okay? So, for those that have been here at classes before, what was different about my class last week as opposed to this week? Or as opposed to previous quarters? I'm kind of an oddball. I look at things a little differently from a little different perspective. So we'll start to see some of that maybe a little bit today. So I just want to set the stage, right? There was a couple of other things that we mentioned. One of them was knowing ourselves. And so the purpose of my classes traditionally is kind of that mirror focus, know ourselves. And we had a quote, and I used a quote from The Art of War, actually, in class, where we should know ourselves and know our enemy. Because certainly our enemy knows us. Okay, and so that's where I want to focus is kind of as we study and as we study this quarter together, that's what we're focused on, is knowing ourselves and knowing that, right? We will be using the book of Job as the hub for the first part of this, so if you want to turn in your Bibles and find that. In this particular Bible, it's about halfway through. Okay, so if you can find the book of Job, we'll use that as the hub. We're not going to read it, word for word and do that kind of technical, in-depth, textual study. The point here is, hey, we need to know our enemy, and we need to know ourselves. And the reason why we need to know our enemy Satan, we talked about this last week, he knows Scripture, and he will use Scripture kind of at us. Right, to get us twisted, to get us doubting some things, and he'll just twist a word here or there, or he'll create some wiggle room in our thoughts to kind of help us deviate. So if we can, at least during our class, know ourselves, we won't lose ground in the war that we're fighting. Okay, and so that is kind of the overarching goal. So as we begin today, I'm going to ask a question, and we're going to do kind of some thought things. So, from your perspective, what does patience look like? Not what is a technical definition. What's it look like?
Taking time to think about your thoughts and your actions before.
Okay. Kind of planning your responses. Okay. Hey, Benny. Yeah. Okay, slow to anger. Okay. Jake?
I was kind of thinking about this last time. It looks a lot like perseverance in a way.
Okay.
Of like confronted by hard times, but pushing you to like the greater goal.
Okay. I see other hands. Nick, and I'll come over.
It has an aspect of intentionality, that you're not just doing whatever comes on a whim, but when you
Purposeful.
decide to act, you're intentional about it.
Purposeful. Yeah. Had a hand over here.
It's not something that comes necessarily natural. It's something you have to work at and try to get better at.
Right. I think we talked about that last week. We're programmed to want things instantly. So patience is something that we have to kind of learn. It's a learned behavior. Okay. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these things in today's class. But I want you to remember these definitions, all of them, because we're going to come back to them about 3/4 of the way through, I hope, if timing serves me correct. Right? So without using a search engine, without using your devices, so I don't have one, does anyone know in Scripture where you see the phrase patience of Job? Okay. It's in James. Okay. Okay. It is in the book of James, and James mentions it, and that's where we're going to start. So Jim, if you could, James chapter 5, read verse 11. And I chose Jim on purpose because he has a King James version of the Bible.
James 5 and which verse again?
Number 11.
Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy.
Okay. Anyone have a first impression about James 5:11? Just a top of mind thing? No? When was James writing this book? Anyone? If you flip back a few pages to the beginning, usually the preface tells you about what the timing is. The scholars think that it was written 44 to 46 AD. Why do you think he was writing his book then? What is going on in the first century? Yeah, Christians are being persecuted. Okay. What else? What else might have just happened recently in the first century? Some things that would have rattled and shook the foundation of Christians. Acts, go ahead, Jane.
I'm shooting in the dark. Is that when the temple was burned?
Okay. Where I was going was in Acts 6 and 7. Who got killed? Stephen. In Acts 8, the Jewish Christians had to flee Jerusalem. It's mentioned. In Acts 9, who was on his persecution tour? Saul. Okay. And then in Acts 12, James the Apostle was killed. So all of these things just recently happened. And so James crafts his book and writes it during that time. And includes what we read in James 5 and verse 11. Why do you think that is? Go ahead, Adam.
In the verse before it, chapter 5, verse 10, he says, as an example of suffering and patience, take the prophets, and then he talks about Job, so trying to throw out some examples of people who have been through this before to give them courage that they can withstand it as well.
Okay. We're going to read a bigger chunk in the book of James here shortly, and so we're going to look at some of those specific things. But yeah, the Christians at this time, and I'm keeping it real high level, so there's no trick questions. They're just simple questions that I think sometimes we just kind of could stand upon. They needed reaffirmation. Okay? Because all of these things that I just mentioned and more were happening to them on a regular basis. And they had no idea who they could trust, who they could not trust. But they needed a standard or an anchor to glom onto. Right? A standard. Do you think that possibly in their upbringing or their stories through the years that they had heard about, the story of Job? Definitely. Absolutely, they knew who Job was. Okay? Why did Job's patience get called out? Now we haven't dove into the deep end of the pool yet, but just in general, why do you think Job's patience got called out?
We could compare to what he's gone through.
Okay. The extreme suffering and things from his story that they knew, they could kind of see that if someone could do that, then what's happening to me at this time, I should be able to endure. Okay? That's an interesting thing, and no, it's just funny. What's happening to us right now recently, too? What's going on in the world? COVID. What else is, just think about all the things. There's more than just COVID, but across, just in the world today, as a Christian, how do you feel? Lisa?
Well, we definitely need to be patient.
Okay. We definitely need to be patient. Society as a whole, are they really accepting? Were you scratching or were you waving? Do people really, are they embracing the church right now, or are they leaving the church right now? If you watch news reports, anybody watch the news, national news, local news? Hey, anybody on social media? How do you think the world is handling the situations right now in general? Good or bad? Thumbs up or thumbs down, to use my social media references? Thumbs down. We're not doing a very good job holistically as a, how can I say, as a race of people. Okay? All right. The largest majority of the world is not doing well. Look around and go back and think about the first century Christians. The largest majority of the people at that point were not doing well. Okay. So as we look at the book of Job, and we start to kind of, pull that into like more of the crosshairs of our focus. Anyone want to venture some tidbits about the book of Job in general first? Like, how old is the book? Go ahead.
I don't know exactly, but the commentary I was reading suggested it was the oldest book.
Yeah. Some scholars out there today believe it's one of the oldest books, written at the time of the Job saying. But have you ever lost anything? Just in general. Your car keys? How do you feel? Then multiply that times exponentially of what the folks that are losing now, right? Got a hand in the back.
So if we're talking about learning our enemy, Job is a very good place to go because, if it's 6,000, 4,000 years ago, or if it's yesterday, Satan does the same things to turn us away from the Lord.
Yes, he attempts the same things to trip us up, right? And so that is kind of good segue into my next point. One of the topics we're going to talk about, before I jump into my point, is we're going to look at why, not necessarily why. We're going to make a statement. Bad things happen. Period. Period. Okay? Bad things happen. And as individuals, bad things happen to each of us individually. It's not all the same. And what is bad for one person may not be bad for another. But you can see holistically here that what happened to Job, I think we could all get behind that and say that was bad. But not all of us are going to experience all of those same things. Some of us may experience some of those things. But in general, bad things do happen, period. And we're going to talk a bit about that and what our responses to those things should be. Okay? So tell me about Job the person and the basics, right? The foundational basics. In Job 1, verses 1. Tell me about Job.
Seems to have the ideal life. Just
Okay.
Just
How-
he's blameless, upright.
Okay.
He has a family. Doesn't say anything about children that have passed away. It seems like 7 children,
Yeah.
7 sons and 3 daughters. So there's that idea of completion.
Okay.
10 and 7.
Yeah. He's described as blameless, upright, right? He feared God, turned away from evil. Any one of those 4, if we were to be characterized as any one of those 4, we would feel like we're something. Now he's got all 4. Who did that? How do you think that would feel? Because even God looked down on favor with him. How would that feel? As you read further into Job, you hear that God is, boasting about Job. Who did that irritate? Satan. And Satan is our enemy. So now we've kind of poked the enemy a little bit, right? Does anyone else find that interesting? Can you imagine God talking about you to those around him as saying, hey, this is the example of what I want my people to be? And someone gets irritated. Hey, as we look into ourselves and we look objectively at ourselves, have you ever heard something good about someone else and get irritated? Yeah. Yeah. It's happened. Maybe not today, maybe not yesterday, but at some point it has happened. Okay? As we look down into the first chapter of Job, what all did Job lose? It's one word answer. Everything, all. He lost it all. Not quite. In chapter 1, he lost it most everything. And how did he respond in chapter 1? What was his words?
He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
Absolutely. So he lost his stuff and his family. Some of us may have lost some stuff, and some of us have lost some of our family, but he lost everything. Yet his response, I can tell you, was different than my response when I've had both of those things happen at different times. So it's an interesting place where Job is at the end of chapter 1. So even after he lost everything, and even after he responded, what was next? Was Satan done with them? No. Satan was still irritated. And so what did he do next? What's the one thing that he still had that Satan wanted to take away? His health. Hey, go ahead. No, go ahead.
And then his wife even was not supportive.
Yeah, we'll talk probably a little bit more about that next week, but yeah, absolutely. No, you're fine. Yeah, Job's wife was like, hey, you're standing there. Why don't you just curse God and die? Be done with this. End it. And I really, the longer I have studied this particular thing in preparation for class for the last few weeks, I get more and more impressed with his response. And probably next week I'll even be more impressed, and then I'll continue to be more impressed because next week I want to talk about friends, family, and the advice that they give us sometimes. That'll be an interesting topic, at least for me to cover. So a question for us, right? After Satan came in chapter 1 and took away all his stuff and his family, and then after he comes in chapter 2 and takes away his health, what did Job do wrong to be punished? Nothing. Nothing. Because we talked about that in Job 1:1, right? He was blameless. He was upright. He feared God and he turned away from evil. He did absolutely nothing to warrant what has happened. So, here's a sidebar, right? A tangent. This is what popped in my head as I walked through this. So I'll pose the question to the group, right? How do you feel about reward systems? And do you know what I mean by reward systems? If you do something good, you get a cookie. If you do something bad, you get something not so nice.
It's like a man-made construct.
Okay.
It's useful in its
Okay.
own right.
All right. You have your hand?
Well, I was thinking of at the very beginning, when he had all these things, and when he said that he had turned away from evil, he very well could have been rewarded all along by God for things that had been going well. I mean, we don't know specifically. We also don't know if he had interacted with Satan before this.
Well, definitely, at least through other people and how they acted with him.
So those are some of the things that we're
Yeah.
thinking about too.
Yeah, so some of the things you talk about, what Morgan said, a man-made contract. We use those reward systems. In work and in family, parenting, you use a reward system. You do good, you get what? Rewarded. You get a cookie. M&M's, Skittles, jelly beans, whatever, right? Whatever the thing is that they absolutely want, you want to reward them. When you do bad, you get what? Some form of discipline or punishment. Right? We use a reward system to train. In this particular case, the reward system just doesn't fit. Because Job was doing, according to verse 1, everything right. So keep that in the back of our mind. And this book basically train wrecks a reward system. It train wrecks it, but not entirely. And we'll get to that at the end. Right? Because here's where I went next. I thought reward system, and then my brain, the way that it works, hey, what is our salvation based upon? Yeah, it's not a reward system. We can't earn it. We can't do enough good to earn it.
Well, it's based on someone else's goodness.
Yes, but we, in and of ourselves, cannot do enough good things to get enough cookies to enter heaven. Yeah. God giveth. Right? We can all say, God giveth. Why do we despair when God taketh away? I think Job shows us an example that while he was distraught and while he was upset and while he said stuff to God and communicated with God in a very open and honest and hurt way, he still, in the end, recognized who God was and had to be reminded. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So, let me just take just one step back and say navigating this material has been a little bit of a challenge. My challenge above all else is to not come in and define to you, this is patience. And here's the 5 things you can do and you can be patient. Done. That's not what I'm trying to do at all, right? Because my view of patience is just totally disrupted in the last month. I go back to week 1. I thought I knew something. How you learn something that you already know. I done learned. Now my challenge is to share what I found. And as we're all in different places, it's going to look different for everyone. It's going to look different to your spouse, to your kids, than it does to you. So that's the point, right? So thinking about the book of Job holistically and all the things that just happened to him, and he had everything taken away, and we've kind of hinted at this a little bit, but do you think Job exhibited patience in the sense that we defined earlier? Because patience is defined by Google Dictionary, right? You search the word patience and you say, in Google, you type patience definition, you get this. The capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. Do you think Job exhibited patience as it is defined in the English language?
According to that definition.
Okay. All right. If anyone would have said yes, I would say, hey, how would we reconcile chapter 7 of Job in verse 11, where he says, I will complain in the bitterness of my soul? And then what would we think about chapter 6 and verse 4, where he says, arrows of the Almighty are in me? He's talking about his body absorbing that. Or in chapter 9 and verse 17, where he speaks of being crushed by a tempest. Or in verse 10 and chapter 10 and verse 16, about being hunted down like a lion. Or the last one I wrote down was chapter 19 and verse 10, of being broken down on every side. Benny?
So at what point is it not patience versus just being completely broken, completely destroyed? I mean, you don't have a scale to measure it, but it literally, my God.
We're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have the patience of Job. And I think we today get twisted on the word patience because of what we believe the definition in the English language says. So I think that's where we're headed through today's discussion. Chad?
And maybe this is where you're going, but I have an NIV and it says perseverance.
Okay.
And in the commentary, it actually says that there's examples where Job didn't have patience, but it was more examples of perseverance. And maybe that's back to the definition.
We're getting there.
Sorry. I was holding back and I was
We're getting there. Okay. Let me skip ahead. In verse 11 of James 5, the word patience, we can see is translated in a number of ways, right? The ASV says patience. The ESV says steadfastness. The King James, as Jim read, was patience. The New American Standard says endurance. The NET says endurance. The NIV says perseverance. Where that word patience is. Okay? So I think when you look at the word, don't get hung up on what the translation of where you are. Look at the context, right? Ryan says this a lot, right? Look at the context by where it's being used. And if you just look at the book of Job and his response, and you like look up the definition of the word patience, you don't necessarily see Job being what we would define as an English language word, patient. You see Job enduring, you see Job persevering, you see Job being steadfast. And that's where I think when you talk about the patience of Job, that's what we need to understand. Because even in the context of the book of James where it's being used, he's talking and writing to first century Christians that are enduring and suffering in ways that we cannot imagine. I don't know that any one of us can imagine being stuck on a stake and lit on fire. I just don't know. That I can't wrap my head around that as being a torch for someone else. I've heard of carrying a torch for someone, but I've never been a torch for someone. Losing your entire family and all of your stuff, and then losing your health right afterwards, and then like, what you gonna do now? It's hard to wrap your mind around that. So what's interesting is when we as individuals hit this point where it's, how can I say, whatever is in front of us is seeming insurmountable and permanent to us, and just no way I can overcome it. We're given these examples to understand and go back and look at. And we're given other examples as well, right? Because the one thing Job never did, what is the one thing throughout all of this that he never did? Yeah, he didn't sin. Right? Some people can say he went back to God and he repented at the end of the book, whatever. But the point is, God still holds him blameless. He did nothing to deserve what happened to him. So there is a lesson for us in that. Here's the other thing. Did Job ever understand why it happened to him? Did God ever answer him? No, he did not. So this thing about why bad things happen, or when things happen to us, we want to know why. We may never know why. Never. And we have to be okay with that, because who is in charge here? God is. Yes. Go ahead.
Something I thought interesting is when we think about this, and whenever we get to Abraham too, is the idea that God knows all of what's going on, and then perhaps maybe when we arrive in His presence, He'll lay it out for us and just say, "Oh, well, it exactly had to happen that way." I thought that was an interesting thought to understand.
Or He may never, and we still need to be okay with it.
I was just going to say, along those same lines, in James 5:20 or 11, what we read earlier, it continues on and says, the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate, or has compassion and merciful. He's got a plan, and we just have to be okay with that.
Trust. Trust He knows what He's doing. Okay? So think about that, right? He never cursed God. So here's during prepping for the class, right? There's another example that I didn't use, but I'll throw it out here. What happens to us? Think about another story in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, maybe, where you had some brothers walking down someplace, and they kind of sold one brother to slavery. Right? The brothers meant it for harm because they didn't like what? Come on, we know the story. It's Joseph. They were jealous. Someone received favor, and it irritated them. So they did something about it. What was Joseph's response when it was like at the end of his story line? Do you remember? Okay, forgiveness. But what did he say? God meant it for good. My brothers meant it to harm me, but God meant it for good. Do you think Joseph understood why, when he was sold into slavery and was going through all this stuff, exactly what was going on? No. So back to the point, God has a plan. God's the creator of the plan. God's the administrator of the plan. He's in charge. All right. So we've talked about patience, right? And some of the other translations' meanings. And so there's a couple of things here. Here are some other scriptures. If you'd like to write them down, or I can email them out. But I'm going to go through a few here that helps us anchor in beyond the book of Job, but anchor in endurance and encourages us to endure. Okay? Galatians 6 and 9, that talks about do not grow weary in doing good. Hebrews 12 and verse 1, run with perseverance. That was one of the translations of patience. Philippians 4:13, familiar to quite a few of you. We can do hard things or all things through Christ. Romans 5 and verses 3 and 4 talks about perseverance producing hope. Deuteronomy 31:8, you are never alone. 2 Corinthians 4, 16 through 18, asks us to shift our focus to eternity. Okay? Shift our focus. Matthew 19 and verse 26, it is possible even when it doesn't feel like it. James 1 verses 2 through 4, keep going to be transformed. Think back to our Romans class we just had last quarter. Colossians 3 and 23 through 24. Work through it with all of your heart. Give it all of your effort. Romans 15 and verse 4, we'll talk about that endurance leads to hope. Endurance is another translation of the word patience of Job. 1 Thessalonians 1 and verse 3 talks about endurance is inspired by hope. Romans 8 and verse 28, all things work together for good. We may not understand it, but that doesn't mean it's not good. Okay? Our understanding is limited. God's is unlimited. And the last one I'll use, and there's several more that we could go through, but James 1 and verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. That last one looks like Job. Looks like Job. So we've talked about this a little bit already, but back to James 5 and the reference, to quote, patience of Job. Does anyone have a note in their study Bible that of what word is used to describe Job there for the word patience? Any Greek words? Because this is about as technical as I'm going to get when it comes to Greek words. Because number one, I'm not a Bible Greek scholar in that sense. I'm not a translator. But I think the word is hypomene. It's two pieces, right? Hypo meaning under, mene meaning remain / endure. That's the word. And the definition that I found was properly remaining under, endurance, steadfastness. And here's the part that I think captures the essence. Especially as God enables the believer to remain or endure under the challenges that He, God, allots in life. That's the word. That's what Job, when you talk about patience of Job, that's what he's displayed. And that's what it looks like. Doesn't mean we don't get upset. Doesn't mean it doesn't anger us. Doesn't mean a lot of things, right? Doesn't mean we just sit in silence and not say anything, and that just, quote, somehow demonstrates our patience. Okay? What we have to remember and what we have to do is behave like Job in a sense to know this is my place in the grand scheme of things. Right? So from the ESV, James 5, verses 7 through 11 reads, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it, until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. And behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have learned of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." So throughout the 42 chapters in the book of Job, we see him enduring, right? We see him enduring, being steadfast and persevering. But we don't see him necessarily just being quiet about it. The question is when we're not quiet, what are we? Are we behaving correctly, or are we behaving badly? That's the difference between what Job does and likely what I do when I become impatient. Right? So here we go. 2 minutes left in class. What lessons can we learn at this point? Right? This is a self-reflection. What did we already know, and how did we learn from that? Anything? Lisa?
Well, he's clearly a man of great faith, because as he was hearing the news, and he stood up and tore his clothes and then worshiped. I mean, he immediately said, naked I came to this earth, through my mother, and naked I will return. The Lord gives and takes away. And, blessed be the Lord. I'm not sure you could have much patience or intentional patience and other good character qualities if you didn't understand the basic thing that the Lord wants us to have in us.
Yeah, and I think when we go into our next section of the quarter and we start talking about faith like Abraham, and then you move into a heart like God, you'll start to see how these things probably mush and merge together, right? So I think you're absolutely right. I think Job is an example for us to use in that respect, right? But understand this. At the end of the book of Job, right? Fast forward to the end of the book of Job. Bad times did not last forever. They may feel permanent. However, in Job's case, misery and joy had an ebb and a flow. At the end of the book of Job, you find what? What happened to Job? He was blessed. So think about our walk individually. And anything that we endure here on earth. And at the end of our story, what are we looking to have God do for us? When we stand in the day of judgment. Reward us. Bless us. No matter what we go through in our life, at the end, if we are good and faithful servants, He will bless us. And He will give us more than we originally had. Because He will give us life. So next week, we're going to talk about his friends. We're going to talk about our friends. We're going to talk about family. We're going to talk about our family. And we're going to talk about how we, as friends and as members of a family, could contribute positively and negatively to folks who are suffering in trials. So I'll give you the last word as the kids are waiting to come in. Any thoughts, any comments before we close? Go ahead.
That same word that means steadfastness or patience is also used to describe Christ in 2 Thessalonians 3:5. That's something to think about. It wasn't just Job, it's also
Correct.
what it is in Christ.
Correct. I think that word, if you were to do word search in Scripture, you will find it applicable in many places. Christ did endure and was one of the examples I was looking at potentially using during today's discussion. Joseph was another one that he also endured. You could look at Noah, you could look at other folks and other examples where you see, hey, Noah and his sons survived the flood. No one else did. So you can kind of think of the endurance there and all the folks that he knew that he lost. So I think when you can really start to apply these things across different stories and different examples, you start to see more and more connection. Thank you for your participation in class. You can let the folks in.